All right, so today we're going to talk about the actual regulation of our internal environment. So we've been talking about how we adapt to the external environment. Now we're going to talk about surviving in terms of what's happening inside of ourselves, inside our internal environment. And a very important part of that is homeostasis. So I love this meme where it says, personally, I don't believe in bros before hoes or hoes before bros. There needs to be a balance, a homeostasis, if you will. Hilarious. All right, pause the video here and have a go at these three quick questions, and we'll have a look at them together in class, okay? All right, so in the study design, we were talking about adaptations last time. All right, today we're going to talk about this thing called regulation, and it goes together really closely with adaptation because regulation is sort of like a form of adaptations in helping us survive. All right, so we're going to talk about how regulating specific factors is needed to maintain a relatively constant internal environment. All right, and this is explained by what we call the stimulus response model. All right, and we're also going to use the homeostatic mechanisms, including feedback loops. We're going to talk about what we call negative feedback. And I'm going to quickly mention what positive feedback is. But negative feedback, you'll see, is usually more important, especially when we're talking about homeostasis. Also, then we're going to talk about different factors that are regulated by homeostatic mechanisms in humans. The three main ones you guys have to know about is temperature, blood glucose, and water balance. All right. And then lastly, we're going to look at two different malfunctions in homeostatic mechanisms, specifically type 1 diabetes and what we call hyperthyroidism. All right, so what is this thing that we call homeostasis? Okay, the homeostasis can be defined as the maintenance of the internal environment in a relatively stable state in the face of changes in either external or the internal environment. So different things are changing the internal environment. So for example, a good example of this is increase in temperature because the sun is radiating solar radiation, solar heat energy to you, and the ground is really hot as well because of the sun, and all of these things, such as if you're going for a run, you're going to have a hot metabolic rate, so your body in itself is going to increase your temperature. It might be a really hot day, all right, and so we're going to get hot humidity and all that stuff. And what would happen if we just allowed these things to happen is you'd probably pass out because you're too hot, and then you could even eventually die. All right, so it's really important that our bodies undergo this homeostasis process by doing things such as radiating heat because we have large surface areas, by producing sweat and allowing that to evaporate, taking away the heat from you, all right? By when you're breathing out literally hot air, and that actually takes away some of that heat from you, okay? All of these are examples of homeostatically regulating your temperature. Okay, so pretty simple, right? We have things that change your internal environment, and then we have things inside of us that we have happen that are going to keep that internal environment more constant. The process, though, is a little bit more complicated than this. So this is sort of a mind map that's outlining all the important homeostatic mechanisms that we have inside our human body. You don't have to memorize any of this, but it is interesting to sort of follow a few of these lines to look at how our bodies do this. So, for example, temperature regulation, which is what we were just talking about, is controlled by the hypothalamus in the brain, all right, which is going to receive information from different nerve impulses that are sent by either peripheral, so thermoreceptors in our skin, all right, and that's going to monitor the temperature in the skin, or central thermoreceptors, which are going to monitor temperatures inside of our core, okay? So that's how homeostasis controls temperature, all right? But temperature in the hypothalamus especially is actually related to your blood water potential, so the amount of water that you have in your body, which is important to be regulated as well, and that's going to be related to the hypothalamus as well. And we have different things to talk about as well. Here we have like blood glucose levels, blood sodium, that's your salts in your body, right? So lots and lots of different aspects to this big idea that we call homeostasis. So what are things that need to be regulated? So these top three, temperature, blood glucose, and water, is the ones you guys have to know about. So, for example, temperature, we want a temperature of about 37 degrees Celsius, not anything high at 39. It's probably we're starting to start talking about fevers then. Colder, we're going to be talking about hypothermia. Okay, we need to regulate this temperature. Blood glucose, so the amount of sugar in our body, is very important that we maintain this within this narrow limit of 3.6 to 6.8 millimoles per litre. All right, and then water levels, you need to make sure that you have the right amount of water in your body. Too little water and you die. Too much water and you die. Okay. Lots of other factors. We've got things such as other ions, pH, blood pressure, urea, which is your wastes inside your blood. You don't have to know these in more detail, but just be aware that they are there. So before we actually go talk about these specific homeostatic mechanisms, it's important to note that not everything that's alive actually does regulate, all right? And the best example of this is unicellular organisms. They can't regulate, all right? A single-celled bacteria has no capacity to maintain itself into a very consistent temperature, for example, okay? Because of this, it means that they don't survive. For example, if you put them in the oven and it gets really hot, all right, but it actually means that they can survive in very specific environments that suit them, all right? An example of this is thermobacteria, for example, in these hot springs. They survive in these hot springs because they're the ideal temperature for them, okay? And also bacteria such as the E. coli that live inside of our stomachs, they love that pH that's extremely acidic, okay? But that also means that if we take that E. coli out of our stomach and put them into nice clean water that we think is perfect to drink, they're not going to survive because the pH is neutral, okay? So they're not going to be able to regulate. Also, some multicellular organisms don't have as complex regulatory systems as us, as humans, especially mammals, do. Okay, this is a bad thing because they're, once again, just like these bacteria, they're not going to be able to survive in different types of environments. But it's a good thing because it means that they preserve energy really well. Okay, I want you to look at this little pie chart here, especially here for the mouse and the snake, okay? So the orange area of this pie chart is what we call thermoregulation, okay? And this thermoregulation, as you can see for this mouse, is a huge chunk of the amount of energy that this mouse needs to use, okay? If you look the snake, there is no part of their pie chart that regards thermoregulation. Okay, and so this snake is able to use that energy that it would have used to keep its body temperature constant for other things that it might consider more important. Okay, so now let's talk about how we actually do this regulation. Before we go on to slightly more complex specific examples, you have to know what's called the stimulus response model. And those students that do psychology probably would be aware of the stimulus response model. It just involves having a specific stimulus. So for the example here, you might be thirsty, and so you have the stimulus that you see a glass of water. Receptors in your eye, the cones and rods in your eye, see that glass of water, and the sensory neuron that's attached to those receptors is going to relay that information to a interneuron or a relay neuron that's going to give that information to our brain, all right, which is our central nervous system. That central nervous system is then going to respond to that stimulus and is going to tell you through the motor neuron to drink the water. Okay, so that's just simply we have a stimulus which through this pathway leads to a response. Okay, so a very specific type of stimulus response model is called the negative feedback system. Okay, and negative feedback is used in lots of different homeostatic mechanisms such as body temperature, blood glucose, blood pressure, whether you're hungry, whether you're thirsty, and also the production of red blood cells, okay, and lots of other ones as well. Let's go through a very specific example of this negative feedback system, all right? Negative feedback is all about having this initial stimulus, right? Going through that stimulus response model where we have the reception of that stimulus, the information, the instruction from the control center, which is usually the brain, all right, and then a action being made that gives us a response, okay? But the importance of negative feedback is that this response is now going to tell us information that is going to push this stimulus down, okay? That's what we mean by negative feedback. That means that the initial stimulus causes a series of things to happen, okay? And these series of things that happen actually make that initial stimulus go down, okay? So that's what negative feedback is. Let's look at in terms of temperature. Let's say you get the flu, okay? One of the symptoms of the flu means that your white blood cells are doing an amazing job of fighting your virus invader in your body, but the flu, because they're doing such an amazing job, that's not how you spell the flu, Mr. Malay. Because they're doing such an amazing job, the flu leads to a fever, all right? And a fever means that we have a temperature of above 38, 39 degrees Celsius, okay? That change is going to be detected on your receptors in your skin, okay? Skin receptors. Those skin receptors are going to relay that temperature change information through these interneurons to the control center in your brain, specifically the hypothalamus, okay? The brain is then going to say to your body that it needs to slow down, all right? It needs to literally pump less blood, all right, and slow the whole metabolic process down. So metabolic processes slow down, okay? That slowing down, that response of slowing down the metabolic processes now means that we're going to have temperature decreases. Cool. So there you go. We have a negative feedback system. Okay. The positive feedback system that we talk about, the only difference, it still has this stimulus response model, all right, is that the response is actually going to make an increase in that initial stimulus, all right? So we're going to get a stimulus that makes things happen, all right? But then we're going to get a response that increases that stimulus. A great example of this is growth, for example. So your body senses that you get to a certain stage of your life, and it has so that's the stimulus, and your brain then releases these hormones that causes you to grow, all right? Your body then senses that you're growing, and it actually releases hormones that causes you to grow more, all right? So that's your positive feedback. But really what I want you guys focusing, especially for homeostasis, is in the negative feedback like this one we're talking about. All right, so there's a couple of different malfunctions and homeostatic mechanisms that we can talk about. The first one is called hyperthyroidism. All right, don't get it mixed up with hypothyroidism. All right, hyperthyroidism is all your thyroid gland, which is this gland here that's right in your throat. You can literally, if you touch around, you can feel it. And that thyroid gland has a malfunction, and it's pretty much told by your brain to produce more thyroid hormone. Okay, more thyroid hormone means that your metabolism actually overreacts, and pretty much your brain just, that negative feedback loop fails, so it senses that it's producing more hormone, which is creating a greater metabolic rate, and then its reaction to that is to produce more thyroid hormone. So you can see that's a malfunction there in that homeostatic mechanism. Another example, which you've probably heard a little bit more about, is called type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is all about your body failing to regulate blood glucose, okay? So in normal circumstances, your body recognizes that there is more glucose or less glucose in the body, okay? If there is more glucose in the body, your body produces this specific hormone that we call insulin, which is a very important hormone. That insulin then breaks down and stores, it doesn't break down, it actually stores that glucose for later use, okay? The homeostatic mechanism that goes with this is if you have too little glucose in your body produces this hormone called glucagon, right? And that glucagon takes the storage of carbohydrates and actually breaks it down and gets you some glucose, okay? Type 1 diabetes is a failure of this, in which your body actually is unable to produce this insulin hormone very well, all right? And that means that even though you have too much glucose in your body can't recognize that, and then now you don't store your glucose properly, and that gives you lots and lots of issues, which unfortunately can have very dire consequences.